Welcome to this final Digit debate for the academic year from an unusually hot UK. We're really pleased to welcome today Professor Vili Leedonvirta, who is a Professor of Economic Sociology and Digital Social Research at the Oxford Internet Institute. Vili is currently the Principal Investigator of iLabour, which is a major research project on online freelancing and the gig economy, funded by the European Research Council. And his research broadly examines how digital technologies are used to transform the way economic activities are organized in society, looking at the implications for workers, consumers, businesses, and policymakers. Vili's topic today will be how does labour market digitalization affect social mobility? So right up our street for the Digit Centre. So without further ado, Vili, I'll hand over to you for your presentation.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and thank you everyone for the invitation and for the generous introduction. And very good to see such a great audience here on the internet today. Very pleased to be here. So let's look at some slides. There we go. Can I get a thumbs up? That's showing all right. Thank you very much. Excellent. So yes, digitalization and social mobility. That's essentially what I want to talk about today through the example of one specific study. Just a little bit on the context first. So as Steve mentioned, I've been fortunate enough to be running this research project called iLabour for the past 5-6 years now, and it's ending in August. And the idea of the project was to understand the construction of remote labor markets on the internet. And so it turned out to be, it was a bit of a lucky stroke. It turned out to be a very timely topic in the sense that gig economy wasn't a thing yet when I pitched the project, but then essentially it became a thing. And now we've got a whole lot of remote working going on as well. So those are essentially gig economy and remote working. That's sort of the intersection of those two is what we've been studying in this project for the last 5-6 years at the Oxford Internet Institute. And I've been fortunate in that I've been able to work with some great postdocs. Otto Kassi, who's now a senior economist at the Research Institute on Finnish Economy. Greta Corporal, who's now at Said Business School. Alex Wood, who's at Birmingham, moving to Bristol. Nick Martindale, who's at the sociology department at Oxford now as a research fellow. And it's my work with Nick that I'm going to be talking about today. In this picture, you see there's a squiggly line there. And that's just for context, that's something called the Online Labor Index, which is a sort of computational data collection tool that we built 5 years ago in this project, which every day downloads all the vacancies from these online labor markets. And I'll explain what the online labor markets are in a minute. And it calculates some statistics from them. And it was purely a research tool for us to have some data to do quantitative as well as qualitative research. But now as the project ends, we noticed that it's been taken up, the data is being used by World Bank, ILO, by OECD in their research publications. And the Online Labor Index will live on. It will have an afterlife. It is having an afterlife after the project. The ILO, the International Labour Organization, is taking it over, and you can access it at onlinelaborobservatory.org, and you can download all the data. It's open data if you want to use it in your research. So class and labor. I mean, class obviously very central concept in sociology, the idea that people in society tend to be stratified into some kind of classes, and that there's different ways of theorizing what those classes are and where they come from. A lot of continental sociology, people look at consumption preferences, highbrow, lowbrow culture consumption as a way of sort of classifying people into classes. And then in Oxford, there's a very long tradition of looking at people's occupations, what jobs they do as the basis of sort of classifying people into working class and professionals and so on. And I don't have a stake in the theoretical sort of sometimes quite heated debates on what's the correct way of classifying people. But in this study, we are taking the sort of occupational view of class. It's a well-established finding, in fact, that parental class background, essentially what jobs parents do, influences what kind of jobs their kids end up in. So a class in this sense is inherited in terms of the choice of occupation, the income level, income growth, income stability, and job security. So parental class is a big impact on people's lives. And obviously from a normative perspective, if we think that society should be somehow meritocratic, or job markets there should be some kind of equality of opportunity, we'd probably like to see some social mobility, so people being able to get to the best jobs, even from underprivileged backgrounds. And for that reason, class reproduction isn't like a wonderful thing. And then there's a lot of theorizing around, well, why does parental class influence occupation? And just to pick one model, essentially rich parents can invest into kids' education. They have money and they have information, and kids with better education, they get better jobs. So that's the indirect influence of class origin on occupation. But then there's also direct influence via social ties, the old boy networks, or dad knows somebody who then gives you an internship, and cultural resources. So having a posh accent and knowing how to behave yourself in an interview situation that allows you to succeed, which are sort of cultural skills or values that are passed down from parents to children. But then there was a lot of theorizing about how this influence is perhaps diminishing in modern or sort of at least post-war society. I'm not talking necessarily just about UK here, but a lot of this research is from the UK. Expanding educational provision. So now a very large proportion of entire age groups get higher education, and as a result, there's less of an association between a privileged class background and education. And also in the conditions of global competition, employers are thought to have an incentive to select people, the candidates, to hire on the basis of their perceived productivity. And so there's less room to do a favor to a friend or something like that, and give a posh job to somebody who is not really up to the job. And so this is also thought to weaken the influence of parental class on occupation. But nevertheless, the class reproduction persists, and there's different levels of social mobility in different countries, but it's not anywhere near zero in any country. Now, digitalization then, how might that influence the parental class occupation link? And so we've kind of we're using this term labor market digitalization, which we've loosely defined as the introduction of digital technology into labor market processes, such as candidate screening, selection, interviewing, and so on. So, for instance, there's a lot of quantified data being used now in companies' hiring processes and in screening candidates. There's algorithmic decision making. So, a company like Google that gets thousands and thousands of applications for each vacancy that they have. Human managers are not necessarily the first to screen, to narrow the list of candidates down. So you have some form of machine selection going on in some cases, and that's based on some form of data that can be obtained. There's different varying extents companies are using data on candidates obtained from social media, from LinkedIn, and so on, to try to quantify candidates before the list is narrowed down. Then you have increasing use of different kinds of online tests and micro certificates in skills validation. So often, if you apply for a job these days, you'll have to do some kind of a quiz online first. And again, it's automatically administered and graded, and it's used to potentially to shortlist candidates. In customer service jobs, you have customer feedback ratings that play into not necessarily hiring decisions, but retention, promotion, rewarding, sanctioning decisions. And then you've got digital mediation is coming to workplace communications. So a lot of, well, especially right now, this is workplace communications over digital media. And then you've got instant messaging, and you've got email, obviously, but Zoom has come in a big way. And it's not obvious then that in this new context, the old class markers, remember the cultural posh accents and nice clothes and so on are conveyed anymore as effectively. So, on Zoom, I might be in a shack somewhere in the Finnish archipelago, not wearing any trousers, but you wouldn't know it because I've got a nice background here. It's true, by the way. The first part, I'm in the Finnish archipelago. I do have my trotters on. So it's not that there's kind of more you can. Well, let's say that there's good grounds to at least speculate that this mediation might be influencing the link somehow. Then when it comes to these skill validation mechanisms based on online tests and micro certificates rather than educational qualifications, or at least in addition to educational qualifications, then you might speculate that maybe those posh degree certificates don't matter as much anymore. And data and algorithmic decision making is of course, if the algorithms have been trained with biased data, then the results are biased, and they're going to be looking for candidates from privileged backgrounds. But there is some research on companies like Google trying to explicitly tune their algorithms to get rid of that bias, because they want to get, in the conditions of global competitions, they want to get the workers perceived as the most productive and not necessarily as the most privileged. At the same time, there's a lot of reasons to be cautious of. So this is our speculation, and then there's previous research on not on this particular topic. I don't think anyone has exactly studied this in the way that we do, but digitalization and social mobility in the labor market. But there's a lot of social research on kind of class and digital technologies, of which I've only scratched the surface there at the bottom of the slide, which suggests caution, because it's a very long standing observation in sociology of the internet that there are digital divides, that the wealthier, urban, more educated people not only have better access to digital media and better able to make use of it, but they get better outcomes out of digital media use as well. They find what they're looking for. They get they get what they want on the internet better. And then there's even these concerns of programmed inequality, which I referred to, that algorithms might in fact be trained and built to be biased to begin with. So there's reasons for caution as well. So against that background, labor markets, digitizing, what are the effects on the link between parental class and children's occupations? We studied what we argue is a sort of extreme case of labor market digitalization. So online labor platforms, websites like Upwork, People Per Hour, Fiverr, in which workers go sign up, create profiles, and people who want to hire them, whether Fortune 500 companies or SMEs, startups, or just individual people. I was telling Steve before the talk that I as a test, for instance, I've had someone from Upwork make my slides look nicer. Not these ones, as you can see, these ones don't look so nice, but that's something that people who work in organizations that are not really graphic designers, but they would like their slides to look nice because they give a lot of talks. I think many of them now go to these websites to buy that labor. So they are sort of labor markets now on the internet, and that's what our research project iLabor, it was studying this new online labor market, and that's quickly graph you saw. It was a graph of how this market's been growing over the years. But in these markets, the hiring process, the candidate screening, narrowing down, all of that is extremely digitalized in all of those ways that I just described to you. So this is a screenshot, a partial screenshot from the user interface. Actually, it's a composite, but it's from the user interface of one of these platforms. And what it shows you is you're an employer in this situation, and you're looking to hire somebody, and you have all these ways of narrowing down the list of potential candidates based on various quantitative criteria, such as their hourly rates and their computationally calculated job success scores and various other things, and their skills and so on. And then you get presented with information on the candidates in strictly standardized form, quantified ones again. So this is the kind of labor market context which we think is a sort of extreme case of digitalization. Also, all the communications between candidates and potential clients, employers are mediated by the platform. They're digitally mediated, they're structured. Everything about it is highly sort of digitized and structured. So there's quite good reasons to speculate that some of those I should mention educational qualifications really don't play a big part here. We've got other research where we looked at that. It's quite a complicated picture, but long story short, of the people here, you're looking at Isabella and Mobeen, both of them based in the UK, and their profiles don't talk about their educational qualifications. So the way they might have some, but they don't talk about them because clients, employers on these platforms don't really choose people on that basis. They evaluate them on the basis of skill tests that they've done, on the base, and very importantly, on the basis of feedback from previous clients, much like in many customer service jobs offline these days as well. So very quantified, very digitalized, extreme case. So in this context, we ask, okay, what are the parental class backgrounds of these workers, these online platform workers, let's call them that? Are they from posh backgrounds? Are they from underprivileged backgrounds? Is there a relationship between class and who's working there. And then, is there a relationship between their parental class backgrounds and the kinds of jobs that they do? So there's, in these platforms, there's good jobs and there's bad jobs. There's a lot of bad jobs. There's a lot of bad job quality, highly varying income, very low pay, low income security, menial, repetitive work. And then you have software development work, for instance, which can pay very well. And we have professional services work, which can pay very well, consulting or whatnot. And there can be considerable continuity in contracts, recurring relationships with clients, employers. They can be high hourly rates, and so on. So there's a lot of variation that other researchers too have talked about. So we're asking, do people whose parents are in posh jobs, do they get posh jobs in the online labor market, or is there no connection? Because if the labor market digitalization is somehow cutting the link between the parents' class and the jobs that people get, then we should definitely see that here in the online labor market, because as I've just argued, it's a very sort of extreme case of this digitalization. Data, this is survey data that I'm going to talk about. So we ran a survey, and I should mention that this survey was also partly funded by CEDEFOP, which is a European Union agency for the research and development and vocational training. And we collected data from 3 major platforms. Platform assisted random sampling means that we got the platform company to draw a random sample of workers for us, and that's from I think I'm allowed to say that. So that's from Fiverr and from People Per Hour. And then Upwork, we also wanted them to help us, and they have helped some researchers and us in the past as well, but they didn't help us now. So instead, we went on the platform and we recruited people ourselves manually. It was a lot of work, and we weren't able to draw a random sample, so it's equal quota sampling. So based on country and gender. And we targeted people from these 6 countries. There's based on certain criteria, different types of kind of welfare society models, from the UK sort of liberal all the way to, you've got Finland there as a sort of Nordic model, and then Germany and so on. And we got about 1,000 respondents in total. In terms of the first question, so parental class background, what kinds of backgrounds do these people come from? The way we operationalize that is we ask, okay, at the time you finished high school, which category best matched your mother's or female guardian's main occupation? The same question for father, male guardian, and then you pick the sort of higher one of those. And this is basically a standard way of doing this. We didn't come up with this ourselves. There's weaknesses with it, but strengths as well. And the options are essentially these classes. So you've got the managerial / higher professional, that's the most privileged class. And then you've got people who are not working or who are in unskilled sort of menial labor jobs and lower customer, service occupations and so on. Now, there's a lot of criticism one could level at this particular way of classifying people, but this is the kind of method that or approach that we're adopting from the previous literature for this study. And here are the results. The first look at the results. So out of the people, those 1,000 people who, remember, they're about half random sample and about half basically equal quota sampling, but not quota based on socioeconomic background. So kind of random. We find that, wow, over a third of them come from a very posh class background. So the number one, the managerial / professional, higher professional, their parents, their dominant parent, the higher parent class is number. So it's very, very posh background. This is completely different from population average. And so that's quite interesting. And if we break it down by country, it's the same pattern in every country, basically. So this is quite a surprising finding. So it seems that in order to get into and succeed in these platforms, and I should have mentioned we had some criteria. So we weren't including people who weren't actually actively working on this side. So there's a lot of people who just create an account, but they're not actually actively working because they're not getting any jobs, so they're not succeeding in it. So we had certain criteria to ensure that we have people who actually at least have some measure of success. So it seems that people who succeed in this online labor market are from quite, well, very posh backgrounds, which kind of goes against the idea of digitalization breaking the link between parental class and occupation. But the more important question is then, as I mentioned, within this platform, there's huge variation in jobs. And in the iLabor project, we classified the online occupations for various reasons into these 6 groups. They're not in order of poshness here, but the first one here, clerical and data entry work, which is very sort of repetitive menial, not necessarily easy, but very repetitive menial, does not require special qualifications or so much training. Is mostly just a matter of practice, and that has the lowest quality in terms of least pay and well, least skill requirement. Yeah, it's a bit, I wouldn't say least formal skill requirement, I would say. And so if we ask, well, how is these respondents, these 1,000 workers, how is their class background related to which of these 6 categories they're primarily working in the online labor market? This is what we find. So the bars, and I will read this because I believe the text is quite small. So I'll explain what's going on in here. So the vertical, well, let's look at the dots first. So starting from left, the first dot is the creative and multimedia occupation. The second dot, the yellow one, is professional services. The green one is sales and marketing support. The blue one is software development and technology. And then the purple one is writing and translation. And what the position of the dot on the vertical axis tells you is the relative risk, so to say, or likelihood of a person being in one of these occupations relative to their likelihood of being in the data entry / clerical occupation, which I mentioned is the kind of lowest quality online work. And the kind of whiskers on those, around those dots, they're error bars, and the ones that straddle 1 on the y-axis, they're not statistically significant. So what that means is that it seems that in terms of likelihood of or risk of ending up in the creative and multimedia category, the software development and technologies or programming work, very high quality work, and writing and translation work, there doesn't seem to be at least a statistically significant link between parents' class and whether you end up in one of these relative to ending up in the worst sort of work. But for professional services and for sales and marketing work, we do find a connection. So if you are from a salariat background, which means the posher half of the parental background, then you are twice as likely to be in professional services in the online labor market as in the clerical and data entry. And if you are, again, if you're from the salariat background, your parents were in the top posh half of the occupations, then you are 2.4 times as likely to be in the sales and marketing occupation in the online labor market than in the clerical and data entry occupation. So here we see a link that people with posh parents end up in professional services and sales and marketing work disproportionately likely in the online labor market. But for the others, there doesn't seem to be a link. Now, if we add some controls, so we look at what else, what might be explaining that, and we add education. So now there's, there's a bunch of lines. The 3 lines on the left, they're professional services. The 3 lines on the right, they're sales and marketing support work. And basically what this tells you is that if we account for differences in the respondents' education, then the effect of the separate effect of the parent's background on your likelihood of ending up in professional services work disappears. So in other words, the link between, well, the statistically significant effect, at least, there's still a positive coefficient, as you can see here, but it's no longer significant. So basically what that means, if we interpret that, is that, or what it may well mean is that people with posh parents end up in professional services work because they have better education. So remember that indirect route in Goldthorpe's model, where posh parents leads to better education, leads to good jobs. So that's what seems to be going on here when it comes to professional services. And it makes sense because this professional services category includes business consulting, but also things like architecture. There's, believe it or not, there's people buying architect services in this market. There's lawyers, there's people buying legal paperwork for their startups and whatnot on these marketplaces. There's accountants. There's lots of professionals who essentially require some kind of qualifications on these platforms, and it seems that access to those jobs is still shaped by parental background, because parental background shapes access to education. But then when it comes to sales and marketing work, none of the controls we add, education or other controls, experience and whatnot, doesn't explain it, the variables we have in the data don't explain why there's an association between posh parents and a likelihood of ending up in sales and marketing work. And we interpret that as meaning that it's still has to do with cultural knowledge, competence, cultural skills associated with sort of middle class norms of behavior, a pleasant manner of speaking, writing emails, skills in writing letters, self-presentation skills, these kinds of things that are quite middle class and that are associated with, I suppose, sales work. That sales people need to be quite smooth and need to be quite socially acceptable, so to say. They can be too edgy. So that's kind of how we interpret, because we don't have any measures in our data of these people's self-presentational skills, for instance. So we think that, but we think that that is what explains why even in the online labor market, we still see this link between parental class and ending up in sales and marketing work. But here's the interesting thing. Even within these occupations, I told you that, you know, sales and marketing, sorry, clerical and data entry is the lowest quality work. But even within these other categories, there's huge variations in job quality, because in the offline labor market, if we can use that term, there's a strong association between at least some occupations and job quality. So pay is quite heavily determined by job title. But here in the online labor market, that's not the case. So there's huge variation. It's very individual what kind of pay you get. So what you see here is bar charts that show the distribution of pay among our respondents in different occupations. And you can see that in the clerical and data entry work, people consistently get paid a little. But then you can see that even in something like professional services, there's a lot of variation. There's some people who earn a lot, and then there's some people who earn a little. And in software development technology, there's even more variation. So just getting into that, the parental background might guarantee that you get, well, not guarantee, but help you get into a professional services job, or into it might help you get into sales and marketing. But that in itself doesn't yet guarantee that you'll enjoy high pay and good job quality. So when we do some multivariate analysis, we find that there's no statistically significant association between hourly pay and parental class background. And also we asked them if, you know, do they think that their pay is too low? And there isn't, many people do, but there's no association between parental class background and people saying that their pay is too low. We asked them if they feel replaceable, and we did find that people with parents in the upper half of the posher half of the distribution are less likely to agree that they feel replaceable. So it seems maybe there's at least a little bit better, at least subjective income security. But then another measure of job security, do they feel like they can replace clients? So if they lose a client, can they quickly get another one? Again, parents class doesn't seem to predict that in any way. So what this suggests is that, as I mentioned, the kind of link between then occupation and job quality is diminishing, because then within these occupations, pay and working conditions, success is not so much based on kind of your occupational group. It's based on your individual characteristics. And this goes back to digitalization. Remember, all that measurement, quantification, monitoring, surveillance of the workers. So people are rewarded and sanctioned very much on the basis of individual performance, not based on entitlement to a particular salary level just because of the occupation group. So in a way, well, let's go to the conclusions and wrap this up so we can have a discussion. So we found that online platform workers on average tend to have a privileged parental class backgrounds. Remember, there were a lot of people with parents from the poshest category. And maybe this is the result of these digital divides in access to online platform work. So in order to get into this marketplace in the first place, you do have to have digital technology, digital skills, and some other skills apparently, or encouragement from parents, I don't know, or ability to, well, there's a whole different entry barrier actually, which I haven't talked about, but which is the fact that often in order to get started on these platforms, people first have to accept very low pay because they don't have a track record yet. There's no data on their performance, right? And if you can afford to do that, so it's like unpaid internships in media industry or something like that. And if you can afford to do that for a while and build up your resume, so to say, then you can start getting the job. So this might also partly explain. But nevertheless, there were, as you saw, there are also people from very underprivileged backgrounds in these platforms. And we find that that parental class is linked to occupational attainment for some online occupations, for professional services, thanks to the better education that POSH background gives, and sales and marketing, which we think is because of the cultural resources, the self-presentational skills. Yet class doesn't mostly predict job quality. So there seems to be this kind of decoupling between occupations from job quality. So you get posh sounding jobs, but without the perks necessarily, which I think is quite interesting. Now, of course, still on average, yeah, the professional services work is better paid than data entry and clerical for sure. But even once you get into the professional services work, it doesn't yet guarantee you good job quality. You still have to kind of tangle with the algorithms and data and monitoring. So in that sense, the link between parental class background and job quality, which was the overall sort of overarching interest that we have, does seem to be somewhat diminished, eroded by the extreme digitalization of labor market processes that we see on these platforms. And if these online labor platforms are an extreme example of processes, of types of digitalization that we also see increasingly taking place in the broader labor market, then this might lead us to speculate that similar things might happen in the broader labor market as a result of digitalization. So they might be more individualized pay and job quality, and less of a link between parental class background and job quality. But that's a sort of hypothesis at this point for the wider labor market. But that is the hypothesis that in this case sort of points us towards, with the caveats that I've mentioned. Thank you very much for your attention.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Vili, for really stimulating and novel talk. I think this research is brand new, so it's great for us to have it presented here at Digit maybe first. So if you have a question or a comment for Vili, feel free to write it in the chat or to raise your hand under the participants tab, and I'll call on you to ask it directly. I'd also invite you to turn on your cameras if you'd like to, so that we can make it a bit more of a face-to-face conversation, which is always a bit nicer for the speaker rather than seeing a wall of black boxes. So I think we have, first of all, Pericles and then Anne McDonald, who both have their hands up. So I will first of all come to Pericles for your question, and then after you, I'll come to Anne.
Thank you. Thanks, Vili. Really got lots out of that talk, that presentation of data and the analysis you're doing. And I was thinking, I was very glad that you made some caveats right at the very end about what we might think of, or I might think of as having parallels with internships. So the capacity for actors who are less dependent on minute by minute, day by day income to build up portfolios. I was thinking about work done by Gandini at King's College about sort of reputation economy and what are the factors that allow a new entrant to one of these digital labor markets to develop a portfolio, a set of reputation, a set of references. And I think you've touched on lots of them, but I'd be interested to encourage you to go a bit further on thinking about the factors there and how they intersect with class, but maybe also race, which you didn't touch on much. But I think that in terms of sort of globalized labor markets and thinking about risks of both algorithmic bias and also cultural, social bias, race is an interesting factor to think about as well.
If it's okay with you, Vili, we'll take one more question because we have quite a few, and then you can come back to the two.
Okay.
If that's all right. So, Anne, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, it was very interesting. You talk about job quality, and you talk about job quality as how much people earn. But often job quality, for example, I'm thinking, you know, if you're a painter and I know it's not digital. If you're a painter and decorator, your your quality of life may be completely different from someone who's got the same sort of pay but in a completely different occupation. So even though I know it's all about platforms, the job quality, you know, if you're on a platform that requires you to work lots of hours or different hours or being more directed rather than you choosing them, that may be different in different occupations, even if the pay is better. Do you see what I mean? Maybe that's something that you have thought about or have data on.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you, Pericles. Good to see you, Pericles. I'll just on the internships. Like, I think enough said about that. I mean, basically, as Pericles says, if you can afford to forego income in order to build up your reputation, then you have an edge. And that way, that is one way in which class is reproduced. And Anne, excellent point on job quality. So I didn't adequately talk about the fact that job quality, of course, there's different constructs of job quality, of course, and it's a broad concept, can include all kinds of things from experienced autonomy and physical stress, psychosocial stress, and so on. And in this study, we've only looked at 2 dimensions, which is pay and income security. And so that is a very significant caveat. We have, with Alex Wood, I've got other work where we've looked a little bit at job quality more generally, and we find that it varies hugely between on these online labor markets, that is, and we find that it varies hugely. So you get people with who say they really enjoy their work because they get a lot of autonomy and flexibility, and they get a varied variation in tasks. Opposite of monotony is one job quality characteristics that I'm sure is important to many people, and these platforms do provide that for some people. And then you have people who say the opposite, that there's no variation and they just have to do one thing that they get paid for. But in this study, yeah, we in terms of linking it with parental class, we only looked at pay and income security. So maybe I should just say pay and income security don't seem to be inherited as much. So parental class background and pay and income security is a more accurate description of what we're doing here. On the immigration background, in this survey, it's very interesting that you brought that up. I mean, if there was more time, I would have liked to do a study on this already 3 years ago. But in this particular survey, 32% of the respondents indicated that their current country where they live is different from their birth country. So it appears that 1/3 of the respondents have some kind of an immigrant background. And in other research, in an earlier research project doing this, studying online labor market workers, online freelancers in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia, we talked to people, for instance, who, you know, they said that because they've moved to another country and they lack the networks in the local labor market to get those jobs, or they lack they're from the wrong ethnicity, or they don't have a work permit because they are a non-documented migrant. That's why they work online instead. So online labor platforms as a sort of labor market inclusion avenue almost, but that's a different topic, so I didn't talk about it in this presentation, and we don't really have very good research on it. I think some other people may have done some research on it, but that's all I know about it at the moment. Yeah, I'll just stop there then.
Really interesting point about how the kind of world flattening technologies actually are embedded in these border policies and migration strategies. So I think next will be Jackie, and then after Jackie will come to Valeria.
I think Valeria was before me. Does she want to ask it first? Okay.
Go, Jacqueline, go on, go ahead.
Well, first of all, thanks for a great talk. And you covered the issue about ethnicity to some extent. Were there any gender differences that you identified is the first question. The second one was the distribution of income within these different occupational categories. Is that because the categories encompass quite a broad range of different types of jobs? So if you're professional services, what does it actually mean? It could on one hand be an accountant or a lawyer, or you could be providing sort of clerical work assistance, doesn't have the same professional qualification requirements. So, and in many of the categories you've got there that might actually just have a lot of variety within them. So why did you choose those ones? I know some of the reasons, but I just want to ask you that, please.
Valeria, do you want to ask your question as well? And then we'll come back to Vili for answers to both.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you, Vili. Very interesting. I have a point. I just wonder whether if you put the platforms in terms of their own structure and the way how they work and the rules that they, kind of develop and the operations, would this picture change, or what kind of nuances would you identify, for example? I was just wondering, well, I posed the question because I was just wondering whether this kind of, complex picture, very interesting that you just highlighted, in capturing the relationship between occupation, parental status, and job quality on the other hand, could be also, kind of a bit perhaps simplified by introducing the firm in terms of the platform into the picture. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Valeria. Jackie, Valeria, this is an excellent question. Unfortunately, that's the sort of devil's bargain that we had to make, which is that in order to, remember I mentioned two of these platform companies, they helped draw a random sample for us, and we're grateful for that. But the condition for doing that was that we will not compare them against each other. So we haven't actually compared differences between platforms. Now, in the Online Labor Observatory that I mentioned, we collect data independently of these companies. So we scrape it off their sites every day. And we do that precisely because we want to have an independent source of data as well. But that is not as rich a data source in terms of, for instance, parental class background. We can't learn that from looking at the workers' profiles. So my answer is that we haven't looked at that, but definitely there's differences between the platforms and their mechanisms, and you would expect that to, for instance, I would expect that in some platforms you will find that the population of workers is from a more privileged background, and in some platforms it's from a less privileged background. Having said that, almost all of these workers multi-home to some extent. They use several platforms to some extent. And so I don't think methodologically sampling across 3 different platforms and then combining the data is unjustified, because conversely, sampling just one platform and saying this person only belongs to this platform is also misleading, because they, as I mentioned, they do work across platforms. And Jackie, so on categories, I mean that is an excellent point. So the criticism is that the categories are very broad, and therefore they might still be people from posh backgrounds might be, if we broke them down into smaller, more detailed categories, then we might find that there is still a very strong link between parental class background and what kind of micro category you end up in. And there's a limitation of our methodology that we cannot examine it that far. And as for gender, so we're actually hoping to, we've released data on that. So, but we haven't studied our own data. So if you go to Online Labor Observatory, you can actually download data on kind of gender breakdowns in different occupations and countries in the online labor market. But we haven't had a chance to analyze that ourselves yet, and we won't have in the span of the iLabor project since it's ending in August. But some other people have done some great research on gender and online labor markets. And basically what you find is that there is occupational stratification, segregation. You tend to find women more in sort of this writing and translation work, and you find more men in software development and technology work. I've blogged about this. There is a blog post about this in the Online Labor Observatory. But there is country variation. So for instance, interestingly, in India, technology work seems to be more gender equal than in the United States. Yes.
Thanks.
Any time for further questions, or is that it?
One final question, if you have the time for it, is that okay? So Mariana, you have your hand up. So if you'd like to ask your question, and this will be the last one.
Okay, thank you so much. My name is Mariana. I'm a visiting fellow at DIGIT, but I'm based in Argentina. And I really like the question your study posed, because at least here is quite an urgent and really important question about platforms. But I was wondering if you consider that maybe some of the results you are getting related to job quality can be explained also by in relation to the idea of moratorium and waithood, in this idea in the literature of on young transitions. Because something we are finding here, we are conducting in-depth interviews, is quite a different kind of research, but something that we find here is that young workers from privileged backgrounds can afford working without being paid to get a better reputation, also to learn English. That is, at least here, it's quite an important thing to get good jobs and to be in the platforms. And also because there is this idea of, I don't know, something like a nomad work and working from different places and all that, that is related to the way these privileged young experience their youth, but this is not the case of other of young people from other kind of contexts. So I think that idea from the difference in this way that they experience this moratorium or waithood could be a good thing to add to your explanation.
Thank you, Mariana. That makes sense. I mean, what I'm learning from you is that that's basically that would be a way of theorizing, of explaining why we see such a strong link between privileged background and participation in these backgrounds, in these platforms.
Excellent.
It's not, yeah. So I don't venture to comment on that anymore, other than to make note and say that is a very good point. So thank you, Mariana.
Brilliant, a great note to end on. So thanks to everybody for your questions. A virtual round of applause to Vili for such a fantastic presentation and for sharing this new research with us here at DIGIT again. Thanks to the ESRC for funding the DIGIT Centre and making this series of events possible. This was our last event of the year. We will be back in the autumn. You should see on your screen in October 2021, DIGIT Debates will return. So please sign up for our newsletter, follow us on Twitter, and keep an eye on your inboxes so that you will be invited along to the next series of talks. Have a great summer, and I hope to see you all again soon. Thanks and bye now.